Hello. Welcome to, and thank you for joining us for this federal forum. These are events that the Office of Federal Relations for Vanderbilt puts on a couple times a year. This is actually our 12th federal forum that we've done, and we try and pick topics that are of pertinent interest at the Washington, D.C. level that also have an impact here on campus. And the idea is that my office, the Office of Federal Relations, can present sort of what's going on in Washington on these sorts of issues, the state of play, a little bit of analysis, and kind of our best guess of what might happen. And then we like to try and involve some folks here on campus who can really talk about how the federal policy that we're working on and that we're involved with, how it impacts folks down here at Vanderbilt. So some of the issues that we've covered in the past include things related to the Higher Education Act, which is the law that governs all institutions of higher education, research funding, regulations related to research and other policies, election analysis, outlook for a new Congress, those types of things. We're also always looking for new ideas for topics for these sorts of events. So if there's an issue that's of particular interest to you, we'd love to hear about it and can potentially consider it for a future forum. Today's topic, once again, is very timely: immigration reform. It didn't take long after last November's presidential election for there to be a general consensus emerging that perhaps it was time to take a serious look at comprehensive immigration reform. From a political perspective, it was acutely aware of, by the Republicans at the national level, that they lost the Hispanic vote in 2012 in a pretty major way. According to the Pew Research Center, Latinos voted for President Obama over Governor Romney by 71% to 27%. The president's national vote share among Hispanics was the highest seen by a Democratic candidate since 1996. Furthermore, the Pew Research found that Hispanics made up 10% of the national electorate, which is growing each year from 2008 and 2004. When you start looking at it at an even more deeper level beyond the national numbers and you look at a couple of the key battleground states, it becomes even more of a stark comparison. In Florida, Hispanics made up 17% of the electorate in 2012, up from 14% in 2008. And the president won the Hispanic vote 60% to 39%. The story is the same in Colorado, where Obama carried the Latino vote 75 to 23% in a state where 14% of the electorate is Hispanic. And again in Nevada, Obama won the Hispanic vote 70% to 25% in a state where the Hispanic share was 18%, up from 15% in 2008. Simply put, I think the Republican Party at the national level has realized that they need to find a way to more broadly appeal to the Hispanic votes, and that one way to do that is to try and address the immigration issue. Our speakers today are going to walk us through what's transpired over the last 7 months with respect to immigration reform. There's been any number of different gangs of 7, gangs of 8, House gangs, Senate gangs, proposals put forward, proposals rejected. And then we're going to hear a little bit more specifically from a campus perspective how what's being talked about in Washington might impact folks here at Vanderbilt, including employees, postdocs, graduate students, and even our graduates and our alumni. First, we'll hear from Margie Glick, who's the point person in my office on immigration issues. Margie's our Assistant Director of Federal Relations. She joined my office about a year ago. Prior to that, she worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio. Margie's no stranger to Vanderbilt, though. She's a class of 2008 alum. So we're thrilled to have her here working on immigration issues. Our campus experts are Dahlia French, Director of the Office of International Services, and Sherif Barsoum, Director of International Student and Scholar Services. Sherif began as the Director of the International Student and Scholar Services in August of 2007. He's been in the field of international education for 20 years. He came to Vanderbilt after 13 years at Ohio State University, and he currently serves as Vice President of Public Policy and Practice for NAFSA, the Association of International Educators. Dahlia came to her position in June of 2008. An attorney, Dahlia has practiced in the field of immigration and naturalization law since 1993. While in private practice, she provided immigration services to institutions of higher education, medical doctors, and researchers. And she left private practice in 2005 to serve as Immigration Compliance Officer for University of Virginia. Finally, I want to emphasize that we really hope that these forums are an opportunity to have real discussion and questions and answers. So after our presentations, I really would encourage folks to ask some questions. Before I turn it over to Margie, I just want to recognize a few folks who have joined us today. First is Beth Fortune, our Vice Chancellor for Public Affairs, and my boss. Important to recognize that. Tim McNamara is our Vice Provost for Faculty and International Affairs. Mark Bandis, Associate Provost and Dean of Students. And I think I saw Connie Benita Dowell, Dean of Libraries, join us as well. So thank you to those folks and to all of you for being here today. And with that, I will turn it over to Margie.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you all for joining us today to get a federal update on immigration policy. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the history of immigration reform in federal policy, and then outline how we've gotten to where we are today and what Vanderbilt has really been involved in, what we care about, and at the end I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. So. Immigration was last reformed in 1986 under President Reagan, and the most recent yet failed attempt in 2007 was under President George W. Bush. So the question is, why reform now? So the reason why we have made as much progress as we've had is there's been a perfect storm. Immigration reform was always a top priority for then-candidate Obama, but another campaign promise got in the way during his first term, and that was health reform. Because of health reform, he used up a lot of his political capital. It took a lot of time, and a lot of his other top priorities fell by the wayside during his first term. However, after the 2012 election, when the Republicans lost the presidency, they also lost more seats in the Senate, some that were pretty big shockers. The Republicans started to kind of self-evaluate, see what had gone wrong, what, maybe did they need to do a little bit different. And as Christina mentioned, a lot of this dealt with their core support had fallen with the Hispanic populations, among others. Thirdly, there's been a growing call to allow dreamers, so individuals who are brought to the United States as children and under no kind of will of their own. They're probably brought here by their parents to be able to become citizens, to be able to attend higher education, to be able to use federal financial aid. And despite there being support in the Senate for this for about 10 years by Senator Durbin, it took President Obama issuing an executive order to allow some of these quote-unquote dreamers to stay in the United States and be reprieved from deportation. And then lastly, the biggest reason why immigration reform has really picked up steam is the economic arguments around it. Immigrants, once they're legalized, can pay into Social Security. We can make sure they're paying taxes. After 30 years of, after us waiting 30 years, the current economic crisis that we've been facing, this is one of the few silver linings. So again, just to highlight the demographic, that the loss of support the Republican Party has faced from minority voters. So. The Senate Gang of 8. You know what? I'm sorry, there's something funny going on with the PowerPoint. Okay, sorry about that. So anyway. Unfortunately, several members of the Senate were willing to put their differences aside and work together to tackle immigration reform. In January 2013, there was a bipartisan group of 8 that came together and came out with a proposal that included a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants in the United States, an expansion of lawful immigration, an increase in the number of visas available to low-skilled workers, and the establishment of an agricultural worker program, as well as laws for allowing an increased hiring of immigrants by employers who demonstrate that they cannot recruit U.S. workers for the positions. Over the next 3 months, a lot of these members worked behind the scenes, and they worked together to come up with this comprehensive legislation that was finally introduced in April. During this time, some of the big disagreements that were faced by these members included access to health care, border security, and a pathway to citizenship. However, the bill was able to move forward due to a few instances of significant bipartisanship. The first agreement was the Schumer-Hatch agreement, which helped address some of the competing priorities between the AFL and CIO in regards to high-skilled, high-tech companies and American workers. Specifically, the compromise addressed displaced workers, H1B dependent employers, and H1B visas for high-skilled workers. In June, another really big kind of accomplishment or positive news that came out of Washington, D.C. was that the Congressional Budget Office, also known as the CBO, estimated that the legislation would save a tremendous amount of money over first the next 10 years, and then if you look at it even a little bit further down the line, the next 20 years. So over the next 10 years, this legislation was estimated to save $158 billion as these newfound citizens and no longer illegal immigrants would be paying taxes and paying more into the system than they were taking out. Over the second, between year 10 and year 20, it would save $685 billion. So tremendous amounts of money, and this kind of announcement in this report really made it hard for a lot of even the most conservative members to argue that immigration reform is not a good thing and we shouldn't continue to move forward on this. That announcement from the Congressional Budget Office led us to the final and a very important agreement for all of us in Tennessee. Senator Hoeven from North Dakota and Senator Bob Corker from Tennessee came together to develop a border security agreement, which I won't go into the details of, but this border security agreement really helped kind of quell the concerns of the more conservative members in the Senate that it wasn't tough enough on border security provisions, and also help kind of eliminate some of the arguments that the House wouldn't be willing to take up this bill because, again, it wasn't tough enough on border security. And for those of you that don't pay as much attention to the House and Senate, the House has is a much more conservative body these days, as Republicans do have the majority. So this bill, it made it out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It passed the Senate. These are pretty big deals. So what was included in the bill? Well, the three biggest components of the legislation, and I'll go into detail a little later in the presentation, is that it provides a 13-year path to citizenship. It also strengthens the border security provisions, which is, thanks to Senator Corker for his work on that. And it also establishes a new merit-based point system to promote legal immigration. So, Vanderbilt University has a very diverse interest in immigration reform. A lot of the people I met with on Capitol Hill didn't necessarily think that a university would have a stake in this legislation, but in fact we definitely do. So over the past few months, Christina and I have worked very closely with Senator Alexander and Senator Corker's office to make sure they were aware of our priorities. And these priorities, which we'll go into a little more detail later, deal with current and future international students, current and future international faculty members, and recent graduates. So in addition to working directly with our members, we also worked with our coalitions and our colleagues at other universities in Washington, D.C. So here are a few of the priorities that we highlighted for our members in regards to immigration reform. And a lot of it really just kind of revolves around the need for us to hire high-skilled faculty and staff and ensure that individuals with STEM degrees can stay in the United States, whether it be on campus or find jobs other way. We don't want people being educated in the United States and then, because of visa issues, deciding to leave the country and go back home or go back to a country where their immigration process is a little bit easier. In regards to international students and graduates, again, you'll hear more about this from Sherif, but international students face an overwhelming number of barriers to attending higher education in the United States, from cost, visa challenges, there's cultural barriers, there are the issues that develop when one spouse is here having a thriving career and the other one's not allowed to work. So it's really important to make sure these hurdles either go away or at least no new hurdles are established in the reform. So one of our top requests for immigration reform dealt with dual intent, which we want to eliminate rules that mandate students provide evidence that they plan to return home after they complete their degree. It's really hard as an 18-year-old to make that declaration that, like, I know what I want to do in 5 years. I doubt many people in this room knew what they wanted to do in 5 years when they were 18, so it was definitely a top priority for us and higher education as a whole. Okay, and the third kind of overarching priority for us was in regards to the regulatory and financial burden. A lot of what we do as federal relations staff is prevent new regulations and new fees from being implemented. Often these fees go to funds that are very vague or funds that we don't quite understand what they're doing with these dollars. So it's very important that the staff either understand the unintended consequences of a new regulation or are very clear with us what these dollars are going to be used for, so that they don't just go into the abyss that can be the bureaucracy of the federal government. We at Vanderbilt already spend a fair amount of money and time helping get international students and faculty members to the United States. So again, anything we can do to reduce the number of barriers and burdens is a positive. So what was actually included in the bill? There was actually quite a bit that was very favorable to higher education. It allows for dual intent. It provides an expedited path to citizenship for dreamers. It's actually a five-year time frame before they can become citizens. And it also allows that these dream students can actually take advantage of federal financial aid programs, which was a significant win because the cost of higher education can, again, serve as a barrier. So the legislation also eliminated a lot of the country-specific limits on employment-based immigrant visas, which have caused big backlogs for countries like China and India. It provided a path to a green card for PhD graduates. It also allows individual STEM fields who are receiving masters the ability to petition for a green card. It also included E-Verify, which is an employment verification system, which has been a controversial topic in the past, but at Vanderbilt, because we do receive federal contracts, it's something we already comply with. But for the sake of those that don't already comply with E-Verify, we wanted to make sure there was a gradual phase-in of these requirements and they didn't just happen overnight. So, the House of Representatives, everyone's favorite chamber. So they have not been as efficient as the Senate. There's been this House gang of what was 8 and now 7 that have been talking about comprehensive immigration reform for years. And they've yet to come out with a bill, and there's that hope that they will in the next few months, but I'm not holding my breath, and I wouldn't recommend you doing that. So we've been working with our House delegation. We've been talking with Reps Cooper and Reps Cohen on the issue of immigration reform and what their priorities are. And Cohen is on the Judiciary Committee, so it makes him a more involved player than some of the other folks in our delegation. So what's really interesting about kind of the state of play right now in Washington, D.C. is that a lot of really key Republicans have come out in support of immigration reform. There were 2 letters that were sent today to House leadership and House Republicans from industry, and then there was 428 companies that signed on to this letter. Another letter that was sent had over 100 Republican donors asking that they move forward on immigration reform. So there is a will for that, or there's a very big, diverse push for this. But the Tea Party, more moderate Republican dynamics are making it hard. Okay, so just to give you a flavor for the type of legislation that the House has been considering, it deals with border security, it deals with high-skilled immigrants, agricultural workers, and most recently there's what is the KIDS Act, which is my favorite piece of legislation because there's no title yet. There's an acronym, no title, and no bill yet. But in theory, it should be like similar to the DREAM Act, maybe not as comprehensive, but they're trying there. The Skills Act is probably the most important to Vanderbilt. It would expand green cards and non-immigrant opportunities for skilled workers. It would increase the number of visas for foreign graduates of U.S. workers. And while it's very similar to the Lamar Smith STEM Jobs Act that was introduced last Congress, it actually has a more expansive definition of STEM to include the biological sciences. So, and of these bills, all have passed out of the Judiciary Committee, excluding the Kids Act, which has not been introduced. Okay, so where do we go from here? We're waiting for the House to act. This August recess, which starts on Monday and will last for 5 weeks, should really help kind of set the tone for what the fall looks like. Unfortunately, there's other very important issues that they're also having to deal with once they come back in September. A lot of them fiscal, a lot of them complicated to solve. So whether or not immigration will become a little, will be debated in September, again, wouldn't put money on it. It probably will, reappear in October after the fiscal issues are addressed. However, again, there are a lot of some of the stars are aligning, and we are still very hopeful that the reform will move forward. So, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. There you go. We'll let the two of them go, and then, is that okay?
Hopefully you'll remember it.
Write it down.
My presentation is focused specifically on things that already went through the Senate that I think will probably still make it in the House. I ignored all the things that the Senate's bill amended out because there's probably no chance that the House would ever put them back in because they're way too liberal for the House. And these will be things that affect Vanderbilt specifically. So if you're following the legislation yourself, you'll see that it does mention a few other visa types, but I'm only going to focus on the ones that we use here. So for us, as it pertains to non-immigrant faculty who are here temporarily, we have not filed green cards for them. The big visa that's affected is the H1B. The big thing that we're going to see on the H1Bs is that the wages are going to go up. The minimum wage is going to go up. For those of you who have done H1Bs with our office, you probably got an email at some point that said, hey, based on the requirements and the skill level, the salary you're paying is not enough and we need you to increase it. And we send you these 4 salary levels to show you that we're not making it up. It's a Department of Labor requirement. That minimum salary, which is called a level 1 salary, is going to increase. But the trade-off with that is the range between the salaries is going to decrease. So you currently now, you may see an employer, a biochemist. The minimum salary would be $38,000. After he has 3 years of experience, the salary is expected to be $52,000. So you've got this really ridiculous jump for not a lot of additional experience. The Department of Labor finally has decided that they've annoyed us enough, and so they're going to decrease those jumps. So they're not going to be as ridiculous as they have been, as they currently are. One of the things that we've lost is that we're going to have to do mandatory ads. We're going to have to prove before we even do an H1B filing that we made an effort to find a U.S. worker. The concerns that we have in the immigration community about this piece of the bill is that they haven't explained any part of the process. And there is a process in place that the Department of Labor uses that's tied to certain green card filings that go through that office. And it's really tedious. So the big concern right now is, oh God, if you give this to the Department of Labor, they're going to make us do this process for H1Bs, and then we'll never get an H1B filed. So that's what we're really watching this one, because we do want to make sure that the process is just not tedious. The H1B cap has been raised, even though that doesn't affect Vanderbilt or higher ed directly, because we are not subject to the H1B cap. It is of value to us. H1Bs fall into 2 categories, cap subject and cap exempt. If you're a cap subject company, you have the 65,000 H1B slots available, and you compete with the rest of the country for one of those slots. If you're cap exempt, like all institutions of higher education are, you can file H1Bs any time of the year. So we support the increase in the H1B cap because we do have a lot of graduating students who do go into private industry, and they're affected, by that cap subject requirement. 65,000 is just not a lot of H1Bs. This year, I think they capped in 72 hours. And that's not unusual. Sometimes it's taken a little bit longer, but this year it was 72 hours. It took a little bit longer in previous years when we had TARP funding, because TARP companies that received TARP funding couldn't do H1B filings, but once those restrictions were removed this year, it took 72 hours to use them up. The cap is going to move from 115,000 to 180, and it's going to depend on demand and the unemployment rate in that particular time. And that's basically it for the non-immigration stuff. Other than that, the fees haven't changed. It's just mandatory requirement. Green cards, permanent residence for our employees. The green card process is moving to a merit-based process, and Margie hit on that a little bit. A merit-based process is basically a point system, and you may have heard that term more so. I think all Western countries use a point system. And I'm from the United Kingdom and Canada, so I'm really biased towards the point system, so I really like this. This makes sense to me now. We're still going to have only 140,000 employment visas issued every year, but nicely, they're divided up nicer. With the point system, there's going to be two tiers. Tier 1 is going to be your higher skilled workers, advanced credentials. Probably most of them are going to have at least a graduate degree, either in the United States or out. Tier 2 are going to be your less skilled, probably a bachelor's degree and lower. 50% of the 140,000 visas are going to go to your Tier 1s and 50% to your Tier 2s. I think that's a nicer balance because employers who don't need people with advanced degrees still have some degree of a competitive edge to get a visa for that employee. Currently, if you're in the group that would be considered less skilled, they're working on visa applications that were filed in 2004. So that's a long wait, especially because things like H1B visas are only good for 6 years. So your employee that you're looking for a green card for might not even be in the United States right now. Tier 1s, the demand is not as extensive, but it is extensive in certain categories, China and India, of course. So they're working on visas that were filed in 2008. So they still do have a degree of a wait in certain categories. And that just the last point, as you can see, that shows how they're going to do the allocation. So you get a point for each of these, in each of these areas, and the more points you have, the higher up in the tier you're in, you'll be. And those in the highest point of their tiers are the ones who will get the visas first. The last piece of legal immigration is that, and this one I love, they are exempting most of the categories that we file under from the tiers. And I just love that. Because I'm not going to get any more calls about what am I going to do for 3 years until I get that green card. So I really do love it. Most of our filings are in extraordinary ability, outstanding researcher professors, STEM grads. We have, I would say, 80 to 85% of the filings we do here on campus are in those groups. And physicians working in medically unserved areas. It's great for us because now we don't have that green card wait. And so for all of you who are principal investigators who just need to get those grants for your wonderful PI or PhD postdoc from India, we can now get that done in probably 8 months or so. The other wonderful thing that they did with the bill is that spouses and children are no longer going to be counted. A lot of people in the United States didn't realize that the 140,000 visas also included your spouses and children. So when you apply for a green card for your assistant professor, if he has 8 kids and a wife, all of them are going to get one of those 140,000. So the 140,000 didn't go to the actual persons you wanted to hire in that category. It also included their family. So when you looked at how many people who are actual beneficiaries, direct beneficiaries of those filings, got visas, the number was really low, because most of the visas were going to spouses and children, which was fine because you want them to bring their family. But it used up numbers in a way that they shouldn't have been used up. And so there had been a consistent push in the immigration community for USCIS to stop doing that. One of the other things that they are doing is they're going to allow us to use the unused visas. Under current federal regulation, if Homeland Security does not approve an application by September 30th at close of business each year, all the visas that aren't approved are just lost. They are not used. So there are many years where we don't even use 140,000 because they just haven't approved the application. And it could be sitting there, and it could have been sitting there for a year, but if an officer just never picked it up and looked at it, that person has lost that opportunity. And it just sits there, and hopefully maybe the next fiscal year somebody will take a look at it. So there are a lot of unused visas every single year that now they are going to try to get a decent count of all those unused visas and start applying them to applications that are pending. So they're doing that in an effort to reduce the current backlog that we have. So the goal is the backlog is supposed to be gone by 2021. I think it'll be gone sooner than that. I just can't imagine it's going to take that long to remove the backlog. But they're going to make consistent efforts to get those backlogged filings that are sitting in the system now out of the way. The last sentence I have there about the elimination of country-specific caps, one of the other things that people don't realize about it is that each country is allowed only a certain percentage of those 140,000 visas, and I believe it's 7.1%, which is why you see extensive backlogs in India and Chinese filings, because they have such a high volume of filings. They are eliminating that. So now there's not going to be any connection between your country of birth, and country caps are done by country of birth, your country of birth, and the progress of your application. So that was the final wonderful piece. So everything about the green card process, we can be really excited about. The H1B process, we can be kind of excited about. So far, it's pretty good. And I think I've used up my 7 minutes, so I am done.
Hello, everyone. I think one of the, let me just piggyback off of Dahlia. One of the things that we may lose because of the 140,000 visas for STEM and H's and so forth, and they've been talking about losing and getting rid of the diversity lottery visas, which is called DV1. The diversity lottery visas are 55,000 visas that are given to different parts of the world that we don't have enough representation here in the United States. So, for example, Tanzania, places like that. And every year for the last 15 years, we've had 55,000 lottery kind of visas that are given that people that can apply for, and people can just come and become Americans. So they're talking about finally cutting that program entirely. Let me get back to the students. As you know, let me give you some numbers, that way we put things in perspective. At Vanderbilt, we have about 1,360 international students from 103 countries. Okay. We also, ISSS serves the other part of the house is the academic side, which is the visiting scholars. And those are about 430 visiting scholars that we currently have at Vanderbilt. And those are people who have already their PhDs and are teaching or doing research. A lot of them are in the medical area, but also in the humanities and all over. Those students and scholars are the ones that we're talking about when we say no more intent. We don't have to prove that your intention is to come to the United States, get your degree, or do your service in your research, and then go back home. Okay, this allows our students after graduation, if they get a good job, to stay in the United States and switch their visa status into a green card, into an H, into a green card, into something else. So that's a good thing. And people don't realize is that sometimes at the port of entry, for example, at New York's JFK airport, if a student comes in and the person is looking at their paperwork and they think that, hey, you know, I don't think yes, you have a visa to enter the United States, but I don't think your intention is to go back home. They can send them on the next plane home. And it has happened before. So that intent is really important, and we've been really trying to put that in the law for quite a bit. In March, I invited Margie to come with me to Advocacy Day, which NAFSA, the Association of International Educators, had in DC, to go visit the Hill. And we actually met with staffers from Cooper's office and Alexander and Corker's office. They were all it was in March, so the debate was just beginning, and so they were all very amicable in starting the debate and talking about it with certain provisions, of course. So I think we had them as allies for sure. Allowing, one of the things we wanted to put down also is allowing B visitors to study in the United States. That has been blocked off for about 10 years. They used to be able to study, come in and as a visitor for 6 months and study for 3 months in a language school or something like that. We haven't been able to do that since 9/11. Now we're trying to get back into having those visitors, B holders, to come in and also study if they want to study. I'll give you a real quick practical example. Anybody here from nursing? Yeah, we have a program, I think, in nursing that they're distance learners, and then they come in just for 4 days, like 4 times a year. Well, that B program would be perfect for these nurses to come in and do their classes here for 4 days and then go back home. And right now we're struggling with, you know, which category to put them in. And I know we've been having emails back and forth, and I think we'll put them in the J category, but it's not the most optimal category because the J, some of them have a 2-year home country requirement, which means they have to go back home after they graduate from Vanderbilt and serve 2 years in their home country, depending on the country we're talking about. So that would be really wonderful if we can get that passed. We're also trying to, I don't know if this was in your bill or not, Dahlia, reviewing, restoring the visa renewals for H's inside the United States. Did that get passed in the Senate? It didn't. We tried to do that in the past as well. You could, a person who has an H could get a renewal of their U.S. visa inside the United States, so when they can travel with ease of mind. And we're probably going to try to do that again, but so far it hasn't made it to even the Senate bill. And then also having spouses of students, F2s. So F1s are students, F2s are spouses. We are trying to have the spouses work in the United States or be able to work, even if it's part-time, in the United States. Again, that might face some hurdles because of the economy, but you know, we'll try to do that. Let me give you a little bit of economic numbers on the impact of international students here in Tennessee. First of all, for the country, the international students contribute $21.8 billion, $21.8 billion to the economy of the U.S. every year. And here in Tennessee, they contribute about $212 million to the state's economy, And if we break it down even further to Nashville, and just Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt students, international students, contribute $52 million to Nashville economy. And the NAFSA just came out with a wonderful chart that we can put in the state, and you can see how many jobs are created, because everybody wants to make sure that we have jobs. And those, just Nashville, just Tennessee, the state, international students support 3,000 jobs in the state of Tennessee. And at the present moment, Vanderbilt has the most international students in the state. Second comes UT Knoxville. There are about 300 international students behind us. So we're still a leader in the state for international students, even though we have about 350 undergrads and about 900 or so grad international students. But those bills are all helpful, especially the DREAM Act. We've been looking at that because we do get sometimes students who are what we call in limbo, and they're kind of in between statuses. They don't have a status, or their parents came when they were like 2 years old, and now that they went through high school and they've never really been back to their home country, and the only country they know is the United States. And so hopefully the DREAM Act will pass through again, and Senator Durbin has been a staunch supporter of the DREAM Act. So I think I'll stop here, and we'll take some questions then.
Thanks to all three of you. Happy to take any questions that folks have at this point. Yes?
Okay, thank you so much. Really informative. I'm Catherine Donato, and in sociology, and I don't work directly except with my graduate students and undergraduate students, but I'm an immigration specialist. So I have 3 questions. Some hopefully can be answered quickly. Rather than ask you how likely this is going to happen, because we know that we're in a state of who knows what over in Congress right now. So rather than ask that question, I want to just know, what's your sense in terms of the political sentiment out there that whatever has gone from the Senate to the House will become a set of very separate bills? And because that's what we've been reading about to a certain extent, that some people are saying, okay, we will do this separately. And so that's number 1. Question number 2 is, what about the working privileges for the H1B spouses? I haven't heard anything about that. And so, Sherif, you're mentioning this. Is that what you're talking about, the H1B?
Yeah.
No.
Actually, I was talking about the Fs,
Yeah,
but
that's
in
what
the
I
H's, it's in there as well.
It's included.
It's included in the H's.
For H1Bs.
But it got amended out.
It
Because the H1B spouses, right, are the spouses of the professionals
Yeah.
that we often bring into the university in different ways, and they have had a long history of being unable to work even part-time.
Right.
So I just wonder, if you don't know.
Well, to my recollection, it was put in the bill and it got amended out before the bill was presented. But are you seeing something different?
It was my understanding, we can double check this, that it was included in the original version of the bill. It would only allow spouses to work if in their home countries our equivalents could, are
Reciprocate.
reciprocity.
Yeah.
So it's my understanding that it was included, but without that provision of reciprocity.
And then third, it is really remarkable, to get back on the political sentiment just for a moment, right, that there are a lot of Republicans and Democrats who are businessmen, who've made a lot of money, whether it's the mayor in New York, and who are very much behind passage of this bill. So I just wonder why, it's not, that message doesn't seem to be happening over in the House. So I just wonder, would you, why that's the case, or what you might say to us in terms of helping to facilitate that message get there?
Those are great questions. And to answer your first one in regards to a comprehensive versus a piecemeal approach, so I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. If I did, I'd be making probably a lot more money somewhere, making congressional predictions and whatnot. I would Speaker Boehner is in a tough position in the fact that he's gotten a lot of grief for passing legislation with Democratic support. And there's been talk, there's what's called the Hassert Rule, which is requiring the majority of the majority to support something before it's brought to the floor. So whether or not there's a bill out there that exists that would get the majority of the Republican Party in the House supporting it is yet to be seen. And a piecemeal approach to some extent is an easier way of going about it. However, their top priorities will likely be Homeland Security and E-Verify, and not necessarily include things like a pathway to citizenship, which is a must for Democratic support. So I give it 50-50. I would not put money, I would be in shock if they took up the Senate bill. Boehner has already said that they will not take up what the Senate passed bill is. However, can we get to a point where they pass a piece, these bills that I mentioned earlier in a piecemeal way, and then conference it so that it passes both chambers and can be, signed by the president? That's a lot of hurdles to get over, but I'm hopeful. I am. In regards, so we'll follow up with you regarding spousal work authorization. That's clearly very important. And then the third question, if you can remind me.
About the message.
Oh, the messaging, yeah. So again, what you have to remember is a lot of these politicians have to listen to their constituents. And for a lot of these members who live in really rural districts, it's about jobs. And there's this, there's always going to be this fear that someone's going to take, their job, and they're not going to see the bigger picture. And that's a lot of America, and these members are abiding by the request of their constituents and doing what their constituents want. That being said, yes, the business arguments, and as I mentioned, there were letters that were sent today from bigwig Republican donors and from industry, and there's a call to action for August that when members are in the state and they're at town halls, that folks like yourself go in there and say, well, immigration reform is really important because it does create jobs and it does help the economy. And members in the House, they hear it. They hear the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. They hear even like Karl Rove has said things in favor of immigration reform. They hear it. It's just they have competing priorities at times, and it's not always going to fall the way that you might want it to fall, or you in the general sense.
The other thing that I would note on, to just build off of Margie's comments with respect to House members, for better or for worse, House districts at this point are often so gerrymandered and so concentrated that if you look at a particular House district, it may, particularly for Republicans, they often don't have a very large percentage of their constituents who are minority voters or who would be impacted by this bill. So you look at, to Margie's point, you look at who their constituents are, and there's been any number of Republicans who have made comments in recent months that, when I listen to my constituents, immigration reform isn't even on the top 10 list of their concerns. Whereas if you took their entire state and looked at what the state's top 10 priorities might be from a senator's perspective, immigration reform would be much higher up on that list. So that's one of the challenges that we're dealing with, is that senators are dealing with a much larger, much more diverse constituency than individual House members are by and large.
And just to clarify on the H4, why we're like in, out, is because the H4 spouses, the H4 spouses can work provision that just said H4 spouses can work as long as they're from a country that allows U.S. Spouses to work in that country and under similar visa. That got removed, but there was a piece of it that said if the Department of State requests that Homeland Security allow this H4 spouse to work, as long as that person's country allows U.S. spouses to work, will do that. That piece got left in. So we have a piece where it's not like it can happen. It's now, if the Department of State asks Homeland Security to do it for this person, it's in. So some of us are like, well, what process is that? How do I get the Department of State to ask?
Yeah, there's no process.
Like, what's the and so for some of us, we're like, well, that's out. So something is there, and maybe the Department of State will come up with a process as to how they're going to ask that, what we have to give them to get them to ask the question.
And also about the piecemeal, we don't prefer piecemeal, but if that's what's going to happen, fine. But for 30 years, we haven't moved on immigration reform. So this is really, like you said, the stars are aligning, and we're going for the big bucks. And if not, we'll take the piecemeal. But we prefer not to take the piecemeal.
Donald?
Dahlia, you talk about mandatory ads for H1Bs and to prove that we can't find a U.S. worker to fill that slot. I'm sitting here from a residency piece. Residency is a competitive process, it's a ranking process. There's no way, there are U.S. people who would fill those slots, and the visa issue comes after people are offered jobs to a match. So how are we gonna wrap our hands around?
And for us, when we saw this, we actually in our office said, oh my God, the easier part is going to be the residencies because they have a ranking process. I actually think that if it's the Department of Labor has provided a degree of allowances to residency programs and to faculty hires, where they do recognize that these processes are built-in national selective processes to some degree. I mean, when you're hiring a faculty member, you're hiring the best of the best. The residencies are similar to that. So they've respected the integrity of those processes, and they've allowed them to go through. In fact, with residency programs, the Department of Labor, the AAMC surveys that are done are one of the few surveys that the Department of Labor will accept for salaries. They don't question that survey. So they have allowances. So yeah, you guys were actually the ones we were happy about. Everybody else.
No way.
Yeah.
No way.
So for fellows that we have coming in on H1s, we'll have to...
Are they going to be clinical fellows? Research fellows?
Research fellows.
My
Yes.
fellows are okay, yours are not.
Right. Right. And so yeah, you can see the problem we're going to have. Yep.
Elizabeth?
I mean, I've been thinking about the same question for postdocs, and I think a similar argument could be made for postdocs that can be made for faculty, which is that the scientific expertise necessary for that particular lab spot or that particular postdoc position is such that there is a very small pool of people who can fulfill the requirements. So, I mean, that's the argument I think we can make for both postdocs and faculty. We still post the jobs, we'll still, collect the data, but
We have agreed with you. The Department of Labor has never accepted it for researchers. They've accepted it for faculty, so there's actually a streamlined process for green cards for that group, but they've never accepted it for researchers. So maybe this will get them to look at that more broadly, but that's been one group that they've been challenged on the idea that there is any...
And so maybe the thing to do is link postdocs to residents in the sense that it's a very time-limited apprenticeship, if you will. We might have more success if we do that.
And you may, and you have to be, what we have to do is be careful about, well, what is the climate and the environment of who we're trying to convince, because if we try to make them similar, are they then going to turn around and say, oh, so we're being wrong? Residents are like fellows? Okay, well, let's take away this privilege.
We don't want to screw up.
Right, we don't.
Tim and then Connie.
Yeah, I have two questions. One has to do with, is related to the question that Catherine asked, and has to do with the comprehensive versus piecemeal approach. Dahlia, what leads you to be optimistic about the House passing reform in those domains in which you discussed in your presentation?
Because nobody involved in that process is undocumented. Okay. I think the House is having a strong hurdle with undocumented. My sense is if you move the undocumented aspects of comprehensive immigration reform out, you would have less problems in the House. They just can't get beyond the idea of giving amnesty to 11 million people, and that's how they phrase it, and that if we give them this amnesty, then we're not going to have any jobs. And I always think, well, what do you think 11 million people are doing right now? They're not all not working. So, but they can't let go of that, and that's the hurdle for them.
And so what about this point system for green cards? How does that work? Who awards points? What are the metrics? Has that been worked out?
You basically, when you do the application, and if you ever look at a Canadian application, it has it on there. It will give you all the categories, and then you add in your information that supports that you meet, you merit the points in that category, and they'll look to see like, well, okay, you have a bachelor's degree. Okay, we'll give you 2 points for that. You have a PhD, we'll give you 7 points for that. So you actually give them the information.
So the applicant actually submits documentation in order to make the case that he or she should be awarded points.
Right,
okay.
in those categories.
Connie.
This was really helpful, but my base of knowledge was so low. And I would not be the reflection of the rest of the group. But on Tim's point about points, I just happened to notice you had an age listed in there. So what's that all about?
Well, age is a value factor. You do want to know that if you're bringing somebody into the United States, they're not coming in and then once you give them, a green card, they're going to go on Medicare or Medicaid. So if you're 80 years old, it's less of a big deal to bring you into the country. If you're 80 years old and you own Google, well, the Google value raises you. And the age thing is less of a factor. So you have to, and it's not to say that if you're 80 you can't come, because you have 80-year-old parents immigrating to other Western countries. But it is one of those things that work against you. The older you are and the less likely that you would be what they would consider to be probably not the right phrase, a productive member of society in terms of you're going to provide some economic benefit, reduces the older you are.
So you're telling me the British Library is not going to hire me?
Well, certainly, because you have wonderful skills and you worked at Vanderbilt, so that will.
The second question I have is some of us have very important management and high technology skill positions. We're having a lot of difficulty recruiting, and we're either down to, we're lucky, a person, and sometimes not even that. And, is this something we should be becoming more familiar with before we launch into trying to maybe expand the recruiting horizons a bit?
You mean looking at the age of that person?
No,
Oh.
it has nothing to do with
Okay.
the first question. The second question is, as we were brainstorming, as we were starting to a third round of a search on a position, one of the questions was right before the forum invitation happened to come out was, should we be looking further afield? Because where we're having the biggest problems are high-level technology skills paired with some other things, or high-level management skills paired with some other things. Just a thought, is it going to be easier to do that in the future?
I think it's going to be easier because, and you work in libraries?
And its staff.
I think that they
usually requires a graduate degree.
Right, and I know we've done a couple of filings for you, and I think we've done at least 1, if not 2 green card filings. Your people comfortably qualified for the filings that we were able to do for them. I think with this wonderful blanket exemption from even having to go into the competitive tier categories, for the categories that we tend to file in, we have less of a worry because now we'll get those visas sooner. But Vanderbilt as a whole doesn't run into, I know like we like to say we hire outstanding people, to a degree we do. And it's not that difficult to get immigration filings done for the work that we're hiring our internationals into at Vanderbilt, because even looking at the skill level and the educational level of those persons, I can tell that there had to have been a degree of a competitive recruitment process because you really made an effort to find somebody who had these specific skills. So it's not hard to get green cards for them. I don't think we have a worry in that situation.
Yep.
Well, you mentioned about recapturing the unused visa. So how do they capture those things? How do they distribute across the EB1, EB2, EB3?
They haven't got into details on that. I think that's why they're saying, well, it'll take us till 2021 to issue the visas out. That may be part of the backlog, because I'm curious about that too. Are you going to recapture those numbers and apply them to the EB3, which is really languishing, which is 10 years behind to get a visa? Are you going to apply them to the EB2? What are you going to do? They haven't said that. They just said that they're going to do it, but that we don't have any details.
How about like the annual 140 we have right now? How do you distribute? It is started from the EB1, if not using the EB1, they go down to EB2.
Right.
So is there any percentage on that one? Or so if they're using everything on EB2, so EB3 are not going to get any?
Right. And you do see a high jump from EB2 to EB3. A lot of people who now qualify for EB2 are filing EB2. I'm sorry, everyone, we're using like immigration lingo, but Jimmy knows what I'm talking about, and he started it. Yeah, so that's what they do. A lot of people who are EB3s are now jumping into the EB2 category, and that's why it backlogged.
Well, if this bill passed, and then if one's qualified for the high skill STEM route, and you want to have your EB2 or EB3 in process, can you file in both simultaneously?
What their intention is, to my understanding, is to convert those. There's probably going to have to be some form that would have to send in requesting a conversion to the STEM exemption route, so that that person doesn't even have to go into the tiered category at all.
So they carry over the priority.
Yep. Yeah.
Donald.
So similar but different issue. What can and what do the departments and offices do to make our life more difficult or more easy in terms of start times without having to go through legislation? So what is it that they can make? And then from the relations side, what do we do in interacting with departments and offices to influence their processes that they might be able to work under that are short of them needing to change actual legislation?
Nope.
We've had some issues about changes in some processes that have potentially delayed start times of residents that, start in September and October when they needed to start in July, and then you get gun shy of even trying to recruit them.
So what should we do on campus? When you say departments, you mean on campus departments? Okay.
Or what can they do? Is there a lot that they can do, little that they can do to
help
us?
On campus, if we're talking about on-campus relationships, it is vital that, you start that immigration process as soon as possible. Documents can be filed 6 months in advance, and I know in some other programs like GME, we're not going to get that information 6 months in advance because of the match date. As soon as possible is what we're looking for. We really need to make that connection with that international who's coming in. And in my office, we like to make a direct connection with the international, so we don't mind if you just send us an email and include the name so that we can engage. Because we find out a lot of information from that person that they just don't tell you. And they don't tell you for a lot of times for cultural reasons. Like we had an employee who didn't want to tell anybody that he had 10 kids because he thought that that would jeopardize his job. But we needed to know because we were getting visas for him. And we started with just a visa for him. We didn't even know he had kids. So we really have been doing a lot of work to get the 2-year-olds into the United States. So we like to engage with them because they feel a little bit, it becomes like this baby bird thing, and they sort of just bond with us, which we want because we need to understand what's going on. So timing, if you're in a position where you can get your recruitments done and we could get the information 6 months in advance, we can really work through that process a lot better. We are very much controlled by what the federal government does. If the Department of State decides that they're going to slow down visa issuances at the consulates, or they're going to do more background checks, or they just don't like people in a certain country, so they're just going to make it more difficult, the sooner that we can start moving them in that process, the sooner we can get them into the United States. And there are some departments that are new to the international world. They don't even know that they need a visa. Sometimes the employee has said, I need a visa. They think it's the credit card. And we recognize we're just going to run into that problem every year. It happens almost every year. Somebody thought the person was asking for a P card.
So at the federal level, when they do make decisions to slow down or other things like that, are there things that we can or that we do to try to help influence their process as opposed to it being an actual legislation issue that would
Sometimes those are processes, because the legislation will be just vague, like the legislation that says H-4 spouses can work if the Department of State asks U.S. Homeland Security to do it. That now becomes a process, and if you go back to Congress, they're going to say, well, we put it in the we put it in the bill. I mean, why aren't they doing it? So now you have to work with the State Department and Homeland Security for them to work out a process that's effective. A lot of that is just, to me, political connections, who you know, who you can get to push it through.
Well, anytime that there's a big piece of legislation that gets passed, then you move, you know, just passing the bill, sometimes it's only the first step, because then it's a whole implementation process. And depending on which department it is, they may have a different process whereby they issue regulations that have a comment period in which the public can weigh in on what the proposed rules are. So there often is, and that's when you really get into the nitty-gritty and the weeds of how do you, in Dahlia's example, if that's the legislative language, how exactly does that get implemented? And oftentimes that's where the rubber meets the road, and where you can really run into unintended consequences. You know, how does the federal government employee at DHS actually write the rules and the regulations to implement what Congress is telling them to do?
So I guess my question is, Christina, does your office, or you and Marjorie, try to help influence that as well, or is your primary focus just on legislation in case we notice problems in one or the other?
We focus on both. I would say our primary focus and our strength is certainly Capitol Hill and the legislative process, but increasingly we're finding that we do get looped into how do we impact and influence the regulatory process. We will be the first to say that when a proposed rule comes out, we are not the right people to write the substance of a comment letter. That's when we really turn to Dahlia, Sherif, or other people here on campus who really know, you know, the ins and outs and how this needs to be written. The role that our office can play is sort of facilitating that process, making sure we dot our I's, cross our T's, submit it by the right deadline in the right format, all of those sorts of things. And to the extent that we have members of our congressional delegation who are particularly interested in a given issue, keeping them apprised of our views and problems that we're encountering with how a law is being implemented is certainly something that our office does.
And they give us the heads up when there is a regulation that's written and there's a 30-day comment period. That way we can comment on that regulation. And the national associations that we belong to, AILA and NAFSA, both do the same thing. And we all, they're always in contact with our federal regulations.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Just really quickly, you said how many H1Bs do we have? Just numbers-wise.
Just H1Bs or every non-immigrant visa?
Here's the,
Sherif, do you have my chart?
I brought the report. We just sent it out because we have to do it. I think 370 is, and if you want to look at the report, it's
H1Bs?
H1Bs, right, on campus right now. Yeah. We have about 700, and as they call it, international scholars. Open Doors calls them international scholars. It includes the J scholars, visiting scholars, which is about 430, and 370 H's. And we do have to report on them every year, and we have from each country what major they're in, everything. If anybody wants to see that report, I have it. We will put it on our website pretty soon.
Any other questions? Thank you all very much for being here.